Good morning.
Octogenarian.
Oh yeah, he can't go facial.
So my husband used to
He can't go very
Peter. It's fucking fun. Over there.
There's somebody out there whose car is like, wee, 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 and the lights are flashing. Is there a way we can make an announcement about it? Martha said the light wasn't working. Is it on yet? Maybe, okay. I'll go up here and see if we can announce it, yeah. Is this working? Oh, I hate to interrupt, but there's someone, if you have a white Audi, license plate JSBAVU, your lights are flashing and the emergency sound was going off. It's right out here. I don't know if that's anybody in here or not. Michigan, like Audi from Petoskey, to be exact.
So, whoops. If you could try to move in so people that get here late can sit on the aisles, that would be great. That would be great. Well, we'll wait another 5 minutes to get started here, so there may be a few latecomers. Turn on, I'm on. It's 10 o'clock, so let's get the show on the road. This is our fourth lecture of the week, and this one, Professor Brands is going to talk about United States is the only remaining superpower after the end of the Cold War. There will be a tent talk this afternoon at 4 o'clock in the tent across the way. And the donation baskets are out there. Your donations are very important for us to be able to continue to do this. And then Professor Brands is going to be signing books in the entryway to Voorhees Hall after the lecture. So I'll turn it over.
And welcome back. This is a Thursday. It's the fourth lecture of the week. It takes me back to when I was a young man, and I had a young family, and I taught summer school because every dollar counted. And summer school is different from the long semester when you teach at the college level. At the college level, you teach maybe 3 days a week during fall semester, spring semester, but you have Tuesday and Thursday off. In summer school, things are more compressed. So you teach every day of the week. And this is even more compressed than that, so it reminds me of that. I told you on Monday of my belief that history is really applied philosophy. And the questions historians ask at the deepest level are philosophical questions. So it's only appropriate that I pose a philosophical question to you today. Do you believe in progress? Do you believe that the human race is somehow getting better over time? Well, we've got one clear vote. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but just a moment of reflection. And I will say that I'm going to guess that your answers, should I poll you, would differ from the answers that I get from my undergraduates. Because I can tell you, from my exposure to them, have I mentioned in here that in my calendar, the first day of the fall semester is the best day of the year. And this because I've arranged my teaching schedule to teach on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday morning. The fall semester at the University of Texas begins on a Monday, as it does very many places. And an undergraduate's daily schedule begins no earlier than 10 o'clock. So on that very first day of class, I have a room full of almost 500 students for whom at least 3/4 of them are attending their very first college class. And you may remember from your own experience that that first week of school, that first day of college, was exciting, it was scary, it was unnerving. You spent 4 years probably getting the hang of high school. And by the time you graduated from high school, you were quite comfortable with that. And for many people, probably most people, you would live at home. And much of your life was just done for you. And all of a sudden, you're thrust into this sort of semi-adult world. And when most of us were in college, we weren't yet adults because at least we couldn't vote. And since we couldn't vote, we couldn't sign contracts and do all that other stuff. You may remember this. You may remember why the voting age was adjusted from 21 to 18.
Yep.
You may remember this, and some of you perhaps were deeply involved in the whole reform process. And maybe you, like me, were aiming for one thing and got something entirely different. You'll remember that it was pointed out during the Vietnam War that it seemed inequitable, it seemed unjust, that people, young men, could be drafted to go fight in Vietnam at the age of 18, but they couldn't vote on the war until the age of 21. And those of us, I'm born in 1953, so I was in high school and then college in the middle of the Vietnam War. And it occurred to some of us, some more than me, but people, well, that it wasn't right. These two ages ought to be squared up. So let's move the draft age from 18 to 21. The wisdom of Congress was, yeah, we'll adjust these two so they're the same. We'll move the voting age down to 18, which I don't remember how much I went into this. I was talking about why it is that, have I spoken to you about why it is that soldiers are always young men? I was talking about that. And I posed the question to my students, why do you do it? Yeah, okay. So there's this, apparently the Congress, in its wisdom, realized that the country cannot afford to give up its 18, 19, 20-year-old warriors. It can afford to give up its 18, 19, 20-year-old, it's not so important that they vote. We need them. We can't give them up. Anyway, so the philosophical question I'm posing to you today is, do you believe in progress? And what I was coming to is somebody, at least one person, was clear in saying no. When I speak to my 18 and 19-year-old students, they all believe in it. And they all believe that as soon as I and people of my age get out of the way, then they're going to be able to fix everything. And I make a point of not disabusing them of that illusion. Time will work its effect. But that is one of the most charming things about being around young people. Sometimes they can be a little bit precociously smug, as in, you just wait till we get in charge, and we'll fix everything. And no, things are harder to fix than that. But I have to say that one of the reasons that I became a historian was that I had this idea that's shared by many of my students, that the world can be figured out, and once it's figured out, then it can be fixed. And so I'm going to try to figure out the world by studying history. What better way to figure out how the world works and see how it has worked and not worked in the past? And once I figure that out, and I decided I'd go into teaching, then I explained to my students how to fix it, and all would be well. And that very sentiment betrays a belief that progress is at least possible. Now, again, one gentleman in the room, not persuaded. But if I put the question to you and said, do you believe in progress? One version is, do you believe that progress is possible? Do you believe that it is happening and has happened? Do you believe that it is inevitable? So there's a stronger versions of the same question. If you're like most Americans, you do, or at least did, believe in progress. You believe that things are going to get better. And this because we Americans are mostly heirs of a Western tradition that goes back to Judaism and Christianity. And Jews believe that a Messiah is going to come. Christians believe that the Messiah has already come and is coming back. And it's all going to lead to this great time at the end. And America, peculiarly among nations, is a nation that almost didn't, well, it does now, but it didn't have a history. It didn't have a common history. We had a starting point that you can pin down. Most nations of the world, most countries of the world, emerged organically. There were a bunch of people living in this area, And then by one means or other, they kind of got together and said, okay, we're going to make a government, we're going to draw the laws, and this is where we're going to live. And so if you look in France, if you look in Spain, if you look in most of the countries of Europe or East Asia, these countries go way, way back. In the United States, because of the displacement of the people who went really way, way back, we're this new country that was created on July 4th, 1776. And so if you don't have a common past, the only thing you've got is a common future. And America has preeminently been a country where people believe in the future. And we've had various waves of progressivism that's built right into the name. You believe in progress. And it characterizes America's approach to foreign policy in the following way. The United States has gone to war recurrently in American history. And there is this notion that it's not often stated explicitly, but it's kind of built into the idea that because we believe ourselves to be a peace-loving people, okay, once again we got to go to war. Something's gone wrong. And we will fix this thing that has gone wrong. We'll defeat that dictator, or we'll do this, or we'll do that. And then we'll go back to the affairs of peacetime, and all will be well. There is this temptation to believe that each war is the last war. If we get it right, then we won't have to do this again. Now, history has pointed out that it doesn't quite work that way. But I will say this, and I'm speaking now to an audience who, from the looks of it, shares much of my lived experience in the sense of we've been on the earth in periods of pretty much of the same. And if you recall, what I recall, there was this idea that the Cold War, well, it was kind of a permanent state of affairs. But if it ever ended, then things would be just fine. And when I say it was seen as this permanent state of affairs, the containment policy that I described yesterday was built on the idea that the Cold War would never actually be fought. It would be sustained, but the whole idea is to keep the Cold War from getting hot. And the Soviet Union would be contained. And the thinking was that if Soviet power, communism were contained, then it would collapse of its own weight. It was a fundamental tenet of American political philosophy and ideology that the communist model of human organization was fundamentally flawed. And if it could be kept from spreading, if it could be contained, then eventually it would die of its own internal contradiction. But nobody knew when that was going to happen. People thought it might happen in the 1950s. They thought it might happen in the 1960s. By the 1970s, it looked like maybe not. And in fact, Richard Nixon reconfigured the American approach to the Cold War by initiating the policy of détente. Détente, from a French word meaning to de-tension, unwind, to reduce tensions. And it set a different expectation, an even longer-term expectation, and the idea was summarized in the phrase peaceful coexistence. Until that time, there had been a belief on the communist side that capitalism would eventually wither. There had been a belief on the capitalist democratic side that communism would wither, but both sides professed that the other was going to cave and their side would cover the earth. But in the 1970s, Nixon went to China, Nixon went to Moscow. And with Leonid Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union, signed these articles of détente. And they said that we're not going to try to destroy you. We're not going to ruin you. And they're not going to engage in world revolution. And so we set in for the long haul. And by that time, I was beginning to think of myself as a historian. I would go to graduate school in the early 1980s. And in the world of international relations theory, there were all sorts of arguments made that this bipolar system was unusually stable because it's just two moving parts, and each one could keep track of the other. And once nuclear stalemate had been achieved, then both sides realized there was nothing to be gained by trying to steal a march on the other, by trying to defeat the other, because you just end up destroying yourself. The term you'll be familiar with was mutual assured destruction. And that kept everything, a lid on everything. And so not only was this bipolar system said to be stable, it was also, I mean, maybe this was just making lemonade out of lemons, but it was also a good thing. Because in international affairs, stability is a pretty good thing, even if it's not, 100% optimal stability. Stability is better than the confusion, disorder that often leads to war, and especially in a world that has nuclear weapons. And so, if you were studying international relations, diplomatic history, as I was during the 1980s, it became just the expectation. This is going to go on essentially forever. Because if you started trying to figure out how it would end, it must end with the defeat, the destruction of one of the two superpowers. And most Americans thought that's not going to be us. And at least it's not going to be us without a big fight. And we assumed that the Soviets thought the same way. And the idea that one of the two sides would simply just give up the ghost and say, we're done, was inconceivable. And if you had taken a poll of international relations specialists, political scientists, historians in 1985, and if you had said, by 10 years from now, the Soviet Union will have disintegrated. But I'm not going to tell you how it happened. Would you vote for that ending or not? Nearly all would have said no, because there's no way it could have ended short of a horrendous war. And some of this was extrapolating from American history. There was a time in American history when part of the country tried to separate from the rest of the country. And it led to the worst war in American history. And most Americans thought, well, we Americans are more peace-loving than the Russians. If we were willing to fight each other to the death of 600,000 people, in the days before nuclear weapons, the Russians will probably do the same thing. But in fact, that's exactly what happened. And people are still scratching their heads and asking, what? Did that really happen? How did this happen? Should it have happened? Could it have been different? And this is where, if you were in my classroom, I would say, on the next line, there is one person, a very important person in the world today, who believes that that should not have happened, and if things had been handled differently, it would not have happened. And this individual is trying to undo that decision to the extent that he can. Write down the name of the individual. So the reason I say this is that the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union broke apart. And Americans thought, this is fantastic. I told you yesterday I wrote this book on the Cold War. And it had what I thought was the mischievous title, The Devil We Knew, which lends the supposition that maybe one day we will sort of regret the end of the Cold War. And that regret set in a little bit sooner than I anticipated. I'm not saying that everybody now agrees we'd be better off if the Cold War were still on, but there were things about the Cold War that people came to appreciate more after the fact than while they were happening. Of course, this is an aspect of life. But there was a moment when Americans thought, we've won, progress has been made, we have fought the last struggle. And thank God the last one didn't have to be fought at arms, at open arms. I should add that when people say that the Cold War was not fought by regular arms, it was this ideological thing. You really have to write the war in Korea as a theater of the Cold War. The war in Vietnam was part of the Cold War. the Soviet war in Afghanistan was part of the Cold War. So it's not fair to say that it was a bloodless war by any means, but it wasn't a general war where the world's great powers are all shooting directly at each other. And so it did have that merit. But Americans looked at the events that were occurring in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, and I think I alluded to the fact that George H.W. Bush did not act all triumphal, did not take credit for this, did not provoke the hardliners in the Soviet Union who might have at the last minute tried to stop it, and just let it proceed. And when it ended with the official voluntary breakup of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991, then Americans could say, we won. We won the Cold War. And not only that, there was a school of philosophical thought, getting back to the philosophical question, that said not only has the Cold War ended, but history itself has ended. Now, I remember the first time I saw that headline. It was originally an article, then it was made into a book. And you have to read into it a little bit to figure out what kind of history is being spoken of here. But it was this question of a contest, essentially, between dictatorship and liberalism, between the idea that the idea that the American Republic is based on, that we have been dealing with for 250 years. Can people govern themselves? Can we govern ourselves? Or do we have to be governed? And one can argue that this has been the fundamental challenge of the last 250 years of world history. Can individuals govern themselves, or do they have to be governed by somebody else? And for nearly all of human history, before 1776, the answer was, of course, they have to be governed by somebody else. Because people either they're too ignorant to govern themselves, or they're too selfish to govern themselves. But it's a little bit like, the old saying that the lawyer who defends himself has a fool for a client and a fool for a lawyer. And it's why surgeons don't get to operate on themselves, or at least they shouldn't. Because sometimes you need to have the distance of being, not an interested party. This is why judges don't get to judge in their own cases. It's a fundamental principle of law. But Americans in 1776 said, well, we're going to try it. We think we can do it. We think it'll be better. And the idea caught on elsewhere. Not everywhere, by any means, but it caught on in more and more places. The progress of democracy can be summarized in the following numbers, and these are just roundish numbers. In 1800, in 1700, there were 0 democracies in the world. In 1800, there may be 0.5 democracies in the world because the United States was a republic, but not yet a democracy. In 1900, there were maybe 10 or a dozen democracies in the world. Making progress, but still a minority, a very tiny minority of the people in the world lived under anything that approached a democratic government. But then from 1900 to 2000, from 1900 to 1990, the number has grown. It has grown because much of Africa and parts of Asia have gotten out from under colonial control, so they're governing themselves. And by the middle of the 20th century, they set themselves up. They called themselves democracies. Although you have to be a little bit careful about self-labeling. And it's kind of a rule of thumb in international affairs, that if you call yourself a republic, you might be a republic. So the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, was sort of a republic, but it had authoritarian tendencies. If you call yourself a democratic republic, then it's less likely that you're going to be a republic or a democracy. So, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And then if you are a People's Democratic Republic, then it's just a dictatorship. Nothing more. So anyway, the end of history coinciding with the end of the Cold War. This challenge, because one way of looking at it, an important way of looking at it was that democracies fought off fascism and defeated fascism in World War II. Fascism is a model of authoritarianism that tends to lean to the right, and there's an alliance between capitalism and big government. And it's often wrapped up in nationalism. So democracy sent off fascism in World War II. And then democracy defeated communism in the Cold War. And that's all the isms, except for capitalism, that's left. And so, Francis Fukuyama, who's a historian, political philosopher, and he was also one of the chief advisors in the State Department, wrote this article in a book called The End of History. And he said that with the demise of the Soviet Union, the credible alternative to the American model of democratic capitalism has disappeared. History has ended. And a lot of Americans didn't get much into the philosophy of it, but they thought, yeah, the thing that we have been struggling against all these years has gone away. Our struggle has ended, and thank God it didn't end in a nuclear war, because that was generally seen as the only way out of the Cold War. One side or the other would be the loser, one side the winner in a nuclear war. And so, for very good reason, Americans congratulated ourselves on winning the Cold War without having to fight World War III. And as I say, if you had polled people who thought about this very seriously 5 years before, they would have said that is impossible. That will not happen. And one of the clearest marks that the Cold War had ended and the American model had won came in the summer of 1990 and extending into the spring of 1991, when Iraq invaded Kuwait and annexed Kuwait. The United States government decided, President George H.W. Bush said, this cannot stand this invasion of Kuwait. It was a textbook example of what the United Nations was set up to prevent or undo. But from 1945 until 1990, with a slight exception for the Korean War, when the Soviet representative on the Security Council just happened to be gone. He was out of the city. So the Security Council voted to kick North Vietnam out of South Vietnam. That wasn't repeated. The Soviet representative made a point of staying in New York. But for the first time, the United Nations responded as Americans, and a lot of other supporters of the United Nations thought it was supposed to. The United Nations Security Council, with the support of Russia and China, said that this invasion of Kuwait by Iraq has to be reversed. And the Security Council said, this is the United Nations, this is Woodrow Wilson's dream of a League of Nations, this is that proto-world government that is acting to build this new social contract that goes beyond nations to the world as a whole. This is a promise of a world beyond war. And it worked. It worked. The Russians were on board. Americans went in, and there was this big alliance, and everybody went in and threw the Iraqis out of Kuwait and ended things, and all was well. And it seemed for a time as though, yeah, we are really making progress. The world is a better, a safer place than it was before. For Americans, one of the big appeals was, thank heavens we will no longer have to spend so much on the military. Because the Pentagon was the biggest line item in the budget those days. No longer, it's now behind, well, Social Security, Medicare, and interest on the national debt. And so people were thinking, man, think of all the money we can save. You may remember the term a peace dividend. The money that we're not going to have to spend on defense, we can spend on schools, we can spend on roads, we can spend on research for healthcare and all this other stuff, all these good things. And that's when the doubts began to set in. Because Americans realized something that some people had noticed before, but now became apparent. The Cold War had been a really big part of the way Americans organized our political economy. And in particular, big spending on the military provided a certain kind of government guarantee of prosperity. Now, this was before your time, but during World War II, one of the grave concerns of American planners for the post-war period was that as soon as the war ends, the Great Depression is going to set back in, because the country went into a depression starting around 1930, and the country did not pull out of the depression until the big surge of spending, government spending on the military, before the United States got in. But it was government spending on the military that pulled the economy out of the depression. And then came the war, and the war did two things to boost employment rates even more. One is, it took 16 million people out of the workforce and sent them to work for the government as soldiers. Okay, so they're on the government payroll. And so there's a shortage of other workers, women, Rosie the Riveter, they all came into the workforce. And so the economy was just booming. And then all that money is also being spent on bombers and tanks and trucks and everything else. When the war ends, remember I told you yesterday that America had this habit of going to war, gearing up, fighting the war, and as soon as the war ends, everybody goes back to peace and do the way things we did before. So it was expected, or I should say the public expectation was, that when the war ends, those two good things that are causing the economy to tear along are going to be undone. Those 16 million soldiers, less the ones who were killed in battle, are coming back and they're going to re-enter the workforce and they're going to need jobs. And the government is going to stop spending like there's no tomorrow, as it has been doing during the war. And so we're going to be back right to where we were in 1937 before this all started. This was a grave concern. And nobody could quite figure out how to keep it from happening. Well, one of the things that was done was, and this wasn't any conspiracy or anything, this wasn't done secretly behind closed doors in Washington, but at the end of the war, when Americans woke up to the fact that, oh, the Russians were our ally, but now at best they're going to be our rival. Because the Soviets looked at, once Germany's out of the picture, the Soviets have one way of looking at the world, and Americans have another way of looking at the world, and it's in the nature of international affairs that if you have different ways of looking at the world, and people do, and if you have the capacity, if you have the army, and the Soviet army was bigger than the American army, then you're probably going to try to influence the outcome of world affairs. So the United States never demobilized after World War II. That was half of the answer. Don't send those soldiers back into the workforce, and don't stop that government spending. Now, it is true that government spending fell, because government spending in the last year of World War II was something like 40% of GDP. That's enormous. It wasn't going to be that high, but it was going to be sometimes as much as 10%, which is way more than it had ever been before World War II. You're familiar, perhaps, with the name John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was a British economist who, during the Great Depression, had proposed this new model of maintaining, restoring prosperity. When private demand falls short, then the government needs to step in and spend on its own. It really doesn't matter what the government spends on, it just has to put money into the economy. And it can do this because it can basically take money out of the pockets of those people who aren't spending on their own. It can tax them, or it can borrow money from them, and it can spend it. And again, it's not important what it's spent on, just as long as it gets into the economy, because then that will spur more economic development. Keynes published his big book, The General Theory. In 1936, he sent an autographed copy to Franklin Roosevelt, who ignored it. Well, I won't say he ignored it, but he did not act on it because he knew that there was no political support for it. Americans in peacetime were very loath to give more money to the government. But then came World War II. And Americans during wartime, there's no limit to what they're willing to have government spend on their behalf for the war. Because when the nation's existence, when the nation's security is at stake, You spend what needs to be spent. And that mindset carried over into the Cold War. Again, I'm not asserting a conspiracy, but the people who benefited from this, the arms makers, the aerospace industry, and all sorts of things, they realized this is a good thing. Well, it's a good thing for their bottom line. It's a good thing for them. It's a good thing for their workers. It's a good thing for the cities and towns that they're in. It got to the point where defense, national security, became this touchstone that made all sorts of projects possible that hadn't been possible before. If you were my students, I would say, in the middle of the 1950s, Congress passed a law that set in motion the biggest public works project in American history. It built the interstate highway system. And do you know what the formal name of the law was? The National Defense Highway Act. It was pitched as a way of making the country secure, of moving troops and equipment across the country expeditiously. There was one part of it that wasn't really advertised too much, but the people who designed it understood this was involved. The interstate highway system was not primarily to move things from Michigan to Kentucky to Louisiana, wherever. You know what it was for? It was to get people out of cities quickly. You know why? Because if it looked like there was going to be a nuclear war, and if we were on the old surface roads before the interstate highways, everybody would be a sitting ducks when the bombs started falling. You build these interstates, and all of a sudden you can clear out the cities more quickly. But anyway, the addition of defense onto the title of that bill made it possible. People had been lobbying for better highways for decades. And the contractors wanted it, and the labor unions wanted it, and the truckers wanted it, and consumers wanted it, but they couldn't get it over the top. They couldn't get it past the railroads. They couldn't get it past the shippers. They couldn't get past the people who had a vested interest in the infrastructure that already existed. But you add in defense, and all of a sudden, okay, I got to vote for this because I can't run for re-election when my opponent says he voted against defense. And that became something that made all of this and even more spending possible. The United States went to the moon in the 1960s. You know why the United States went to the moon in the 1960s? To beat the Russians to the moon. If not for the Russians, I don't know if we'd ever have gone to the moon. And we haven't been to the moon since the Cold War ended, since that competition disappeared. Anyway, there was something of a peace dividend at the end of the Cold War, but it was nowhere near as large as people had expected. In part because, well, boy, we've built this economy that is based on all of this spending. And I'm a member of Congress, and there's a military base in my district, and a lot of people work at that military base. And if you close the base, they're all out of work. We don't want to do that. And who knows, we might find a new use for our soldiers. But the new use for soldiers was kind of hard coming. I remember attending a conference on national security planning. This is in the mid-1990s. And one of the speakers was the recently retired former American general who headed NATO. So, America's top soldier for the NATO alliance. And people had been proposing various peacetime uses for the military. And so they could become peacekeepers in places in the world that are trouble spots. And they're good at building things, and so they could build infrastructure in poor countries, and they could do this and that. And he said, well, this is all well and good, but what we do in the military, we do two things really well. We break things and kill people. And if you want things broken and people killed, come to us. But But if you want something else, go to the UN. Go to other people. Because we have developed the mindset of fighters, of warriors. We destroy stuff. And to try to make us over into school teachers or healthcare workers or something like that, it's going to undermine the purposes for which we still need an army and a navy. So don't do it. And in fact, it turned out that there were uses for America's army and navy. Because, and this gets back to the original question, do you believe in progress? Do you believe that we're getting better? Do you believe, okay, I'll put the question more sharply right now. Do you believe that there will ever be a time when war has become obsolete? When humans just don't do war? I'm going to give you some examples of things that we humans used to do that we don't do anymore. Human sacrifice was maybe surprisingly common around the world thousands of years ago. And when it didn't rain, or when it rained too much, or when something bad happened, you appease the gods by sacrificing a human. The gods know we're serious about it. Cannibalism. Often ritual, it was never really a matter of dietary stuff, but ritual cannibalism. That was, again, fairly widespread. We don't do that anymore. Slavery, legal slavery. Slavery was legal essentially everywhere in the year 1800. It didn't occur to any nation of people. It occurred to a few radical religious groups that slavery might not be a good thing. But for everybody else, it was a matter of, I don't want to be a slave, but there's a lot of things I don't want to get cancer either. But you can't just wish cancer away. You can't just wish slavery away. In 1800, slavery was legal everywhere. In 1900, it was illegal almost everywhere. So we don't do that anymore. Now, some of you might point out that actually slavery is still done. It's just not done openly. So, and is that an improvement or not? But my point is that there are certain things that humans used to do that we don't do. Certain big things that we used to do that we don't do. So is it possible that we used to do and we still do war? I'm going to ask you a show of hands. How many of you think that at some point in 20 years, 50 years, 500 years, humans will have figured out how not to do war anymore? And war will be just this thing that's consigned to the history books. I got 1, 2, just a handful of hands. Okay. I got the rest of you really don't believe in progress. Okay, that's the way it goes. So, anyway, it turned out that the world wasn't quite as taken by the idea of progress as Americans defined it, that the government of Russia wasn't quite as pleased with the outcome of this breakup of the Soviet Union and being seen, as it inevitably was, as this caboose on the American train that was driving down the tracks in the early 1990s. Because Americans made no apologies for, or no pretense that we weren't, the world's only remaining superpower. We were it. And in fact, there was a new label that was coined for us. We were a hyperpower. Because this is even better than a superpower. There's a great power, well, there are powers, then there are great powers, and then there's superpowers, and there's a hyperpower. Now, here is something that many Americans, not all Americans, but many Americans became confused by, and therefore became disappointed in the aftermath. And that is to say that you are the greatest power on earth, that you're the only hyperpower, you're the number one. That's an assertion. And in 1993 or 1994, it was certainly plausible to call the United States the greatest power on earth. So the United States is more powerful than anybody else. It was sometimes possible for people to extrapolate that to say, not only is the United States very powerful, it is all powerful. And therefore, whenever anything goes wrong, anywhere around the world, the United States can fix it. So here comes in another philosophical question. And it relates to what I was speaking about a few days ago. And that is about altruism and interest. So I'll put the question philosophically. If you see some bad thing happening, what obligation, if any, do you have to stop it? You know the runaway tram car experiment, where the tram car is rolling down the tracks and there's some kids playing in the tracks, and there's a switch that you can turn, and so if you turn the switch, and then it's done in various ways. There are 5 kids playing, and 5 little kids playing over here, and then there's one little old lady in a wheelchair over here. And you have this choice, and you have to make the choice right in the moment. If you do nothing, the kids get killed. If you do something, the only thing you can do to change that is to decree that the old woman gets killed. Is that a choice you will make? So that's not exactly what I'm talking about here, but it's close. Because, for example, in 1994, a genocide occurred in Rwanda. It was certainly within the capacity of the United States to do something to diminish the mass killings. But the United States did effectively nothing. And did the United States do wrong by doing nothing? What's Rwanda to the United States? In the interest, if we look at altruism and interest, the interests of the United States were not materially damaged by doing nothing. They would not have been materially enhanced by doing something. But on the strictly moral side, well, lives could have been saved. But then the question is, these always get more complicated. Lives could have been saved as long as the American troops were still there. So are the American troops going to be there forever? And this is one of the things you get into. This is why, for example, the United States, under President Biden, finally pulled out of Afghanistan. As long as American troops were in Afghanistan, they could probably keep the Taliban out of power. They could maintain the uncomfortable status quo of the previous 20 years. But as soon as Americans leave, then it goes back to where it was. Does the United States have an obligation to maintain that status quo at the price of keeping American troops forever? Now, in fact, American troops have been, in some places, effectively forever. American troops have been in Germany since 1945. American troops have been in Japan since 1945. And we're only talking about a relatively small number of troops. At the moment of the final evacuation, there are only several thousand American troops in Afghanistan. So how do you weigh this? And it gets to another sort of philosophical question. And this has to do with, why do people do bad stuff? Is it intrinsic to people? Is it just that people are going to do bad stuff? If you take a fairly common Christian view, it's all because of original sin. And we're fallen, and if various other religions say, well, good and evil are fighting themselves out in your soul and all this other stuff. Is that why people do bad stuff? Or do people do bad stuff because they're misled? Because they're ignorant? Could we ever expect, the world to govern itself? If, again, is war or peace the natural state of humanity? If humans are basically peaceful and left to their own devices will be peaceful, then we could do away with our armies. And the end of the Cold War might have signaled an end of all the military stuff. We'd have to deal with, well, how do you stop spending so much on the military and keep the economy from imploding? There's that stuff. Except maybe that's not separate. Maybe this is all tied together so tightly that we'll never do the experiment. There's one last thing that I want to get at, and this will set us up for tomorrow, and that is the question of why did the Cold War end? Why did it end without World War III? What was going on here? Vladimir Putin has his interpretation, and that is that the leadership of the Soviet Union simply lost its nerve. Maybe it lost its mind before it lost its nerve. But the reform program Mikhail Gorbachev set in place wasn't necessarily flawed, but he let it get out of control. And then the people who knew better let the Soviet Union fall apart. And in Putin's thing, as far as I can tell, he's going to try to put things back together. Now, I'm going to say something very provocative, and you can agree with it or not. But I would say that what Putin is doing is not that much different from what Abraham Lincoln did in 1861. Except that there's a greater time lag between the secession of the various socialist republics in 1991 and Putin going to war. Well, he started going to war almost as soon as he got into power, but sort of the big stuff in the 2010s. And the time lag in the case of Lincoln was secession began in December of 1860, and the fighting didn't begin until April 1861. So it's months on the one hand, years on the other. But in both cases, it was out of a belief that a great power holds on to what it has, and you don't let parts spin away. And in the case of Lincoln, most Americans, I live in the South, and there's some Southerners who would differ on some of this stuff, even still. But the argument on Lincoln's side is we got to hold the Union together to show that self-government can work, and we'll free the slaves. So the end result is a good thing. Okay? Putin would make kind of essentially the same argument. And, if we don't fight with each other now, we'll fight with each other later. Okay, leave that aside. One last thing to keep in mind. And that is, what was the role of American economic policy in the Cold War, the end of the Cold War and where we are today? Why was there no World War III? If I ask you why was there no World War III, I'll give you three alternatives to ponder, and then I'll take questions from you. One is no World War III because nobody ever came up with a good reason to have a World War III. There's just, you don't just start a world war for no good reason. And maybe there just wasn't sufficient reason to have a world war. In Europe, nobody found a sufficient reason to have a huge war between 1815 and 1914. So maybe we're still in that range of, I can't think of a good reason for war. Number two is, and this is the most common explanation, nuclear weapons made the cost of World War III so much greater than any benefit that might be derived that nobody in his right mind would start a war. And that might be true as far as it goes. You've got to be careful because not every national leader is always in his or her right mind. And this has been a weakness of the MAD, the Mutual Assured Destruction philosophy, all along. If you have a crazy person, then they're not going to do that analysis. But here's the last one I'm going to put to you. And that is that what has prevented World War III until now is America's promotion of free trade, starting in 1945. Because America took the position that we won the war, but we're not going to stick it to either our former allies or our former enemies. In fact, we are going to make the world a place where we can all do business together. We will become each other's best customers. And countries that are each other's best customers, they don't go to war with each other. Why would they want to? They spoil the whole thing. I'll leave you that, and I'll take any questions for a few minutes.
All right.
And then more
questions?
So I have to bring up Gaza. I think we're remiss not bringing up, and I think it's lifted a big mask of American history of settler colonialism and the dehumanization of groups of people that allow us to be evil or bad, but I think we're inherently good, but the power of Hollywood and everything that makes us look at Arabs or black people or Native American or anything as other, I think it's just reframed everything because it's lifted the mask because we're seeing a genocide on our phones and we can't be propagandized anymore so much by the power of the media and the government, and it's just a whole nother framing of of looking at the United States and our role, and as we are funding this genocide with our government money.
So the question is, I'll paraphrase, America's role in supporting Israel, I didn't put it this way precisely, in the war in Gaza and the stuff that's been going on in the Middle East. Okay. So, and you mentioned Hollywood, the dehumanization of people. One thing I will point out, that the worst war in American history was not Americans against a people that they thought of as inferior or grossly different. It was Americans of the North fighting against Americans of the South. So you can have a really bloody war, and you don't have to dehumanize the other people. Now, there have been wars when the other people have been sort of dehumanized. But interestingly, in World War II, American propaganda portrayed the Japanese as this sort of evil, strange, mysterious Eastern race. And there were very strong racial overtones in the recruiting, in the propaganda against Japan. Strikingly, nothing like that, no argument like that was made against the Germans. And so you've identified something that happens during wars, but I would suggest it's not a necessary, you don't have to do it to go to war. You can find reason to go to war. The whole question, in fact, tomorrow I am going to address more directly how America got to be the guarantor of peace or so deeply involved in the Middle East. Can I hold that until tomorrow? Because it's a big question. It requires a long answer. Yes?
Other
I have a
questions?
question.
Yes.
As you've been talking, I can't help but think of immigration. And so I know this may be a little off topic, but in countries of the world, where do people go to immigrate when they're seeking citizenship someplace else? Does Russia have a problem with seeking, with too many people coming to their borders and trying to get in and become a citizen? Does Saudi Arabia have that problem? Because it seems like certainly people want to come here and be citizens, but where else is that an issue? And I think that just speaks to the type of government we have. So I'll just leave it.
Yes. So the question is, why do immigrants come to America and not to some other places? So some other countries have had very strict anti-immigration policies. Japan, for 4 centuries, killed any foreigner who arrived on Japanese shores. And that pretty much stopped immigration. But there are reasons that if people come to America, there are multiple reasons people come to America. Millions of people come to America, and for each person there are multiple reasons. But I would suggest, and this might not at all differ from what you're talking about, but a principal reason people come to America is that America has historically, for the last 200 years, has been the richest country on earth. And America allowed people to come here and get rich themselves. And so, and I would add that during all that time, from the very beginning, from before there was the United States of America, this question of immigration has been contested. There were those people who said, open the door and bring them in. There are other people who said, no, we don't want people who don't look like us, people who don't speak like us. This is a place for us. Now, I'm going to pose another philosophical question to you. This is a philosophical, ethical question. I'm not going to ask for an answer, but I'm going to pose it. Do people in one country have any responsibility at all for the welfare of people in another country? Is there a human responsibility that transcends nationality and borders? And it's a perfectly defensible position to say, no, we have no responsibility for anybody else. But I've never heard an American government or an American leader take it that far. The question is, where does our responsibility start or where does it stop? And if you were to answer it, no, we have no responsibility for anybody else, then you can operate entirely on the basis of that interest rather than altruism. But we humans don't live that way. We like to think of ourselves as good people. And so if some starving person arrives at my doorstep in the middle of the night, I'm not going to say, I don't know you, and therefore go away. They'll do something. Do we expand from that to a policy as a nation? If we do, how far do we do it? Now, I should also add that in the days when America had an open door policy regarding immigration, as it did, from 1776 essentially until 1924, with the exception of Chinese workers starting in the 1880s, it wasn't out of an attitude of charity toward the world, despite what it says at the foot of the Statue of Liberty. It was because American employers wanted lots of potential workers. And in the debates over immigration, there have been two sides that you can identify quite conspicuously. And they are those people who want more potential workers, so typically so we can pay them less, or so they won't have bargaining leverage. And then there are those who don't want more workers because they do want the bargaining leverage. And from 1776 until the 1920s, the balance came down on the side of the employers. We want more workers. We're going to bring them all in. But by the 1920s, the labor side of the equation got greater control. And so we're going to say, keep them out, because they just drive down wages. Now, there are other aspects of the immigration question. Do they look like me? Do they speak like me? Do they have my same religion? Are they changing my values? Will they learn the English language and all this other stuff? But at the very basic level, that drove much of the debate over immigration. And it really, and the part about, should we let them in so they can share the benefits of American liberty? They weren't coming so they could vote. They were coming so they could get a job. And that was the main thing. I think, are we running out of time?
I think it's time for the book signing.
Oh yeah. Do that.